Some more Victorian perverts? Sure. Let's look at some more women. We covered children, we covered some men who strayed from the norm, we covered the working class people, including the women who worked as prostitutes. But there are quite a lot of women from the higher sections of the society that might also stray from the norm. So, first of all, what about those lesbians? If you read or watch any neo-Victorian stories, lesbians are everywhere in the Victorian culture, just like vampires or just like dragons in the Middle Ages. They are just everywhere. Were they really everywhere? Probably, as you might expect, there were as many of them as in any other period in history, but definitely the Victorian world was not easy for them, even though it wasn't as hard as for the gay men. The Labouchere Amendment, which I already mentioned, said absolutely nothing about female homosexuality. And there are some stories, there are some rumors, which are probably not true, but they are quite symptomatic, about some legislators wanting to include the crime of lesbianism into the amendment and prosecuting it. And of course, like any law in England, it required the royal assent, so the signature of the Queen. So somebody had to go to the Queen and explain to her what the crime was about. So apparently, I'm not sure I believe it, but the story itself is funny. Apparently, some members of parliament went to Queen Victoria with the project of the law and tried to explain to her what they meant by female homosexuality. And apparently, according to this story, Queen Victoria refused to sign the document in this form because she could not believe that anything like this existed in the world. In some versions of the tale, she expressly says that two women could not do anything sexual with one another. Good for her. So, and of course for all the women who were spared the legal prosecution. Generally, if we think of the situation of lesbian women in the Victorian period, they were tolerated. We know about some women who might be lesbians. We would never be sure for one reason. The great popularity of romantic friendship for men and women. I already mentioned this homosocial society in reference to men and male friendships. This could be very similar in case of women. So it was culturally acceptable and even promoted or expected to have very strong emotional attachments to your friends, the friends of the same sex. So people, men and women, would very often form very close, deep, emotional, romantic friendships. At school, at university, with other people. They would write passionate letters, they would declare love, they would declare eternal, fidelity, or sometimes they might even live together. Especially in America, there was this practice or this kind of phenomenon called the Boston marriage after the Civil War, when many men were killed. Women who lost their fiancés or other male members of their family, or sometimes even husbands, would sometimes live together with female friends for companionship, for economical reasons. Some of them might be lesbians, but probably not every such couple had any sexual content to their relationship. So this really leads to a kind of twofold situation. On one hand, before the 1980s, the 1990s, you don't have any lesbians in the Victorian culture, because every attachment between women would be dismissed as a romantic friendship. Everybody would say it's just romantic friendship. This is the way they expressed emotional attachment. There was nothing sexual in it. On the other hand, nowadays, some scholars, especially younger scholars, more politically radical scholars, say that there were lesbians everywhere. Gay people, lesbians, they were just everywhere. Everybody was having sex with everybody. There was no such thing as romantic friendship. This is all conjecture. They were all having rampant sex. Probably not. I would say that probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, but whether it's closer to the idea of the romantic friendship or this kind of underground gay and lesbian world, we will really never know, because it would have to be more or less conclusive in many individual cases. Definitely it was not part of the identity. There was no such thing as LGBT in the Victorian period, because even if people were having some romantic, emotional or even sexual relations with people of the same sex, they did not build their identity around it. It was not a politicized question. Most people married anyway, unless you were really against it. If you were a man, you might devote more time to your work and become a kind of confirmed bachelor. If you were a woman and you refused to get married, you had very limited options, because there were very limited possibilities of employment. You might, if you were extremely talented, you might be able to earn by writing, to become a writer, to become a journalist, but it was really rare. The most popular form of employment was to become a governess or a teacher. Later, after the Crimean War, you might become a medical nurse. Generally, it was believed that working women from the middle class should retire from work if they wished to get married, even in the middle age. So if there was, let's say, a female teacher working in a girls' school for some time and she met somebody she wanted to marry, she was supposed to quit her job. So many women were quite hesitant, especially if they were well settled, with the idea of earning some money. Those who were not as lucky to have an education and an employment and still did not manage to get married, because either they chose not to, or more often they didn't have any proposals because of whatever, usually the family financial situation, because marriage was still a money issue rather than a feelings issue. They would be relegated to a very sad category of spinsters. Spinsters meaning unmarried women of a certain age, which would be slightly different depending on which generation we are talking about, but on average, if you did not get married by the time that you were 30, you were a lost cause. Of course, there are some stories of women much older than that marrying or having younger partners, or just, you can find any sort of personal arrangements at any time in history, but not everything was mainstream. And spinsters were figures of ridicule, figures of pity. They were supposed to be financial burden on their families. They were rarely allowed to live alone, so very often they were supposed to take care of the parents in their old age, or to help the married sisters or brothers raise their children. So they might be some sort of resident aunts. There was the funniest thing about spinsters, which I found, was one in kind of medical publication from the Victorian period, saying that they put their health in danger because of their celibacy. Just like men endangered their health by masturbation and spilling the seed, women who did not marry and did not have legal, legitimate sex with their husbands put their health in danger because they would not receive the seed from the man, which was so beneficial and healthy. And this lack of sexual intercourse in marriage could result in spinsters in the same list of diseases as masturbation would cause in men. So madness, blindness, tuberculosis, consumption, cancer. The funniest thing I found, I can tell you which book it was, but I would have to check the title, is that this doctor warned spinsters, celibate spinsters, against syphilis if they did not have sex. Tells you something about the state of medical knowledge in Victorian period. So we have this whole problem. Then what might go wrong if you manage to be a middle-class Victorian woman who got married? Two things: divorce and contraception. So you still could end up as a fallen woman. The first case is divorce. The first legal possibility of obtaining divorce in England was in the mid-50s. Before that, the only way to obtain the divorce was through an individual act of parliament. So you may remember this is something that King George IV tried to do, to divorce his wife, but the parliament did not grant him the divorce, to the king. So imagine individual people trying to get a divorce through parliament. It did happen, but it was like, I don't know, just a few times, maybe 20, 30 times in a century. So definitely it was not for everybody, not even for the very rich. These were rare individual cases. And of course, there was a growing awareness that marriage, especially arranged marriage, is not always happy, that people grow apart, that there are all kinds of problems such as infidelity and violence and drunkenness and homosexuality also. I told you that many gay men married for convenience. So the Marital Causes Act from 1857 was passed, and this set a special court in London which would grant divorce to people on different grounds to men and women. If a man wanted to divorce a woman, he would only need to prove that she was unfaithful, that she had a lover. He could actually sue the lover for damaged property. This is something very interesting and quite shocking to us. If a woman wanted to divorce her husband, infidelity was not enough. She would have to prove something more, such as homosexuality or abandonment or cruelty or some other extra crime. Infidelity of a man against a woman was not enough. If it was to be the only cause of divorce, the woman would not be granted divorce. So the other way of ending the marriage, which was rare and again very, very difficult to obtain, was to get the annulment. It means the declaration that the marriage was never valid. And there were basically two reasons for annulment. Bigamy, so if one of the people entering the marriage were already married to someone else and then the previous wife or husband was found. Sometimes these were dramatic cases, so people were marrying in good faith. For example, a woman believed her husband to be killed in the war. He did not return for many years. She fell in love with someone else. She wanted to start a family with someone else. And then years later, the first husband appeared and the second marriage was automatically annulled. So it was not always the case of some sort of wrongdoing. The other possibility was non-consummation. So the idea that there was never sex involved. So that the woman, after some time of being married could have the kind of medical examination to prove that she was still a virgin. And here comes Effie Ruskin. You mentioned Effie Ruskin when we met last, and that's the story to illustrate such a case. The wife of John Ruskin, the very respected intellectual, art historian, art critic, the man behind the success of the Pre-Raphaelites, he was married to a beautiful young woman from a relatively wealthy and well-respected Scottish family. Her name was Effie Gray. They were married. Nothing seemed wrong until some time later, like 5 or 6 years later, Effie Ruskin fell in love with one of the Pre-Raphaelites, John Everett Millais, during a holiday they had together. John, Effie, and Millais. They were posing for some paintings, but what happened was that the painter, who was young, charming, and very talented, fell in love with Effie, and she reciprocated his feelings. But they were both very moral people. They were both very well-behaved and moral people, so they did not want to start a kind of secret liaison. They didn't want to cause some sort of scandal. They both respected Ruskin, if anything else. So they started talking about what they could do, and it transpired somewhere in the conversation that Effie was still a virgin, like 5 years into the marriage. There are, again, lots of stories and lots of rumors of why it happened. Whether Ruskin was impotent, he had some medical condition, he couldn't consummate the marriage. He said before the court this was not the case, because Effie pleaded for the annulment because she wanted to marry Millais, and the whole thing got to court and caused a public scandal. Apparently, again, I don't know if it's true, but this is the most popular story, that Ruskin was terrified by his wife's nakedness, because being an art historian, he only knew the naked female body from paintings and sculptures, and in the classical paintings and sculptures there was no hair. So when he saw the kind of bodily hair on Effie, who was beautiful, young and well proportioned, and there was nothing deformed about her, he thought she was some kind of monster and couldn't get himself to consummate the marriage. Whatever the case, this was a massive scandal. Like, the point of the scandal was that this man had some sort of sexual problems, and he had so much respect and admiration and authority in the society. Anyway, they were given the annulment, and Effie married Millais. They lived long. They had lots of children later on, so they absolutely consummated the marriage. They have like 8 children together. So she joined the norm, you might say. She actually joined the Victorian norm. So she became the middle-class wife in a faithful marriage with lots of children, and that was the situation. The last thing is contraception. They didn't really have anything effective. So all those neo-Victorian stories that tell you about people trying to avoid conception, they were gambling. They were really gambling. Some of the traditional methods, like the withdrawal method, were just not effective. So sometimes they worked, more often than not they didn't. If they worked for somebody, it was a matter of luck rather than precaution. Some of the methods, like condoms, they knew condoms. They actually had the technology. They had a notion of such thing. And if you would like to see how Victorian condoms were made, watch an episode of Victorian Pharmacy. They actually do a batch, and it's not very exciting, I would say. It's not very erotic. But if anything, condoms were not used in marriage. They were Their principal purpose, or at least the intended purpose, was to protect against sexually transmitted diseases. So they were more connected with the culture of brothels, with the culture of prostitution. They would be used by the clients of sex workers in an attempt to prevent the infection with venereal diseases, especially syphilis. So what they tried to do was to prolong periods of abstinence, to promote later marriage and actual sexual abstinence before marriage. And this really became a problem that was discussed by intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century, in the last quarter as well, when they observed that very high birth rates among the poor contributed to poverty, misery, disease, and death in the poor areas of the cities. So some intellectuals and activists, including one woman activist, her name was Annie Besant. She was a kind of socialist, she was a kind of political activist supporting women's rights in different areas. She once got involved in a strike in a match factory which employed women in very unhealthy and dangerous conditions. So she and her politician friend, I don't remember, I'd have to check his name, they published a pamphlet about the need to limit the procreation among the poor, and they started distributing this pamphlet, which mostly advertised such methods as later marriage and sexual abstinence among the working class. And they got arrested and they were sent to prison for it. Because any kind of informative publications, any kind of informative books or pamphlets to the eyes of the law were equal with pornography. So when they tried to argue that this is just medical information, there was no such category. They were convicted as some people spreading pornographic materials. They went to prison for a couple of weeks, and that was the end of it. Because contraception was a big issue for the Victorians. And again, all those discourses, the moral, the legal, and the medical, were used to limit the access to knowledge even. So, again, the only moment when it changes is the 1960s, when the effective hormonal pill is first available. Before that, we have some sort of movement. Sometimes they are quite scary and dark, like the eugenics movement. So some intellectuals, some very important intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw, for example, believed that people could be bred like cattle. So those who had better genes and better living conditions should be encouraged to have more children, and those who were living in poorer conditions and they had worse health and worse genes, they should be discouraged from having children, or at least limited in the numbers of children they had. This sounds harmless enough, but of course in the 20th century in Germany, this was one of the justifications used by the Nazis to exterminate entire groups of people, like the mentally ill or the Jews even. So to improve the human race. So as you can see, it's quite a big problem that arose from something that was, again, like most things about the Victorians, done in good faith. I think that's more or less it And we are left with 2 more subjects. So next week you'll have a double dose. So you have like week 13 and then week 14, and I'll ask you to watch them both. Week 13 will be about the British Empire, the growth, importance, cultural significance of the British Empire, and week 14 will be about the Edwardian period and the end of the long 19th century. Thank you.